beta, so you can do that. So these two scenarios, and one more scenario is non-compliant OS. Let's assume we support any, maybe depending upon n-1, n-2, n-3, how many operating systems, then the current you want to support, you can support. After that, we are going to lock it out. If suppose user gets his device, which is 3-4 years old, it never used it, it suddenly turns it on, we don't want that device to be plugged to our network, because we don't know what are the vulnerabilities now in that device, and we don't want that device to be attack factor for any attackers. So whenever you see the device is online, you can lock it. So this is the 3-4 scenarios what I am going to explain in the flow, so that it will be easy for us to see. So this is the architecture diagram, the resources, whatever we are going to discuss in this session. So each step I will take step by step, and what happens in the stage, and what happens like input and output for the each stage. Okay. This is the high level architecture diagram. These are the resources what Rain explained, EventBridge, Jamf, Lambda functions, all the resources that we are going to use in this session. So as I said, so it's a deployment group assignment. Let's take that example. So once the device get enrolled, at the end we have a policy. That policy sets a value to an attribute. So how many of you are Jamf 200 and 300 certified? Nice. So in the class, they explain how you can set a value to a Jamf attribute. So it may be asset tag, room, department. Even they may ask this in the question in the exam, that sudo Jamf recon hyphen whatever the attribute you want to set value to, right? Here we are using a asset tag, but in your in your company you already use the asset tag, then you can use the room, department, whatever attribute is not used, and it's available. So I will run at the end saying that, okay, Jamf, set my asset tag to EA ID equal to 10% group. Okay, the EA ID may be, for example, 3. So 3 represents the deployment group of my EA in the ES extension attributes. So I'm telling 3 equal to 10 to the asset tag. That means I want to set value 10 to the third EA. Okay, and I'm ducktailing the same request by adding a semicolon or whatever the delimiter you want, saying that, okay, set the release group to GA for this device. So whenever a device provision, we are setting the two values. One is as deployment group 10 for this device, and GA release group. Done. So Jamf sets those two value in the Jamf. In the console you can see those asset tag. So the asset tag got added. That means we have a smart group, as Rain explained. So no more asset tag smart group is empty. It got a new device jumping into it, saying that, hey, I am new device, I am meeting your criteria. So whenever there is a change in the asset tag smart group, it sends a trigger to listener. Because we configured a webhook saying that whenever there is a change in the smart group, which smart group, this asset tag smart group, then send a webhook. So those kind of URLs you can generate using the Jamf API gateway. Okay? So API gateway, you have the URL, and you are using that URL, and if you want, you can authenticate. The webhooks can be authenticated or unauthenticated. So depending upon how you will configure. So here we are going to discuss about the authenticated webhooks. So you have that URL and the authentication token that it can use to authenticate. Okay? So webhook went out from the Jamf to the AWS now. Okay? So here you can see Jamf is sending a webhook to the AWS API gateway, and API gateway fetches authorization script. It's a custom authorized Lambda function which we wrote. So that Lambda function fetches the auth token for this particular request from the secret manager. Secret manager is kind of a vault in the AWS. You can store secrets, and if you think your company doesn't support the secret manager, then you can store it your own vault, maybe CyberArk or HashiCorp. So whatever the vault you are using, you can pull it from there. So you will pull and you will validate whether it is authorized or not. If it is not, you will reject. If it is authorized, you will process to next stage. So now the API gateway sends the request to the event bus. So it's a custom bus where it collects, event bus is like a queue where you get all the requests into the queue. From there it will process one by one. So that event bus sends the details to the custom bus. From there it will go to the event bus rules. Here you need to configure the rule depending upon which rule should execute. So each rule has its own syntax. So as we discussed earlier, the event in that webhook event template, so you can see that here. So we are configuring this particular rule saying that if JSS ID is so and so and group is device added, if you can see there are two computers in the example. So if those two matches, then send it to the asset tag script. If not, then it will go the same rule, the same request will go to the next rule. So how it works is like it passes through all the rules in the AWS EventBridge, saying that whichever matches, it triggers that rule. If nothing matches, it will ignore. So that's how AWS works. So for our example, it's matching with the asset tag Lambda function. This Lambda function is wrote in such a way that it reads whenever there is a request comes from the webhook, it reads the devices from the added devices and it goes back to the Jamf, uses the ID and fetches the details of the asset tag. So you see, we created the asset tag value via recon. So that value now here this script is reading from the Jamf. Okay, to establish a connection with the Jamf, this script goes back to the API Secret Manager. It pulls the token. Okay, token. If token is not valid, then it goes back and gets the credentials of your account to generate a token. And it stores that token back to the Secret Manager. Why? Because we don't want to generate the token every time. We want to utilize until it expires, so that you can have less API calls to the Jamf generating the token. Okay? So we get the token and we process the request. So once we know asset tag need, like EA need to be updated, we fetch that and we do it with a single put. Whether it's a 2 EAs, 5 EAs, 10 EAs you want to update, it can be done with a single API call. Okay? Similar to this is one of the example what I was referring till now is the release group and deployment group. Similar to this, if user wants to opt in into the beta program or early adopters program for his device, the client side is same. Like he clicks the policy, but policy does the same thing, and it goes back to the smart group, and it comes back to the here. The flow is same. Like once you configure the infra, then you can utilize n number of use cases, whatever you want. Okay. So similar to that, whenever the non-compliant OS comes online, it falls into the smart group, and it goes and triggers that. So here, instead of reading and updating the EA value, you send an MDM command. In this scenario, I'm just explaining of the device lock. Maybe you may use, depending upon the CS benchmark, you can disable the Bluetooth or whatever XYZ you want to do on the device, you can do that. So I'm back to Ray.
So I'm going to cover some additional considerations, right? So we've first got a QR code here that connects you to a list of resources around setting up a webhook listener in AWS and general guides about setting all of this up. One of the things that we found a lot of value out of setting up infrastructure like this is that it doesn't just have to stop with Jamf, right? Having infrastructure in AWS and with Lambda functions and things like that, you can then start to hook into other systems like Slack and different reporting, emails, things like that. So you can generate additional actions based on what you see coming across smart groups or some of other of those webhook fields. It also is incredibly affordable. These kind of serverless functions in AWS don't cost a lot of money to run, even at a really, really big scale. And additionally, for us, moving those API actions off of the endpoint so they're not happening right there was a great improvement for us from a security posture perspective in reducing that attack surface, right? always cover for every single attack that's out there, but we can take steps and change kind of how we do things to reduce that attack surface. On the housekeeping side, things to kind of consider are webhooks are fired when a device enters and leaves Jamf. So you'll have to do some logic depending on what you want to action on. Maybe you want to know when something leaves a smart group, and you want to take actions on that. This is an incredible opportunity for us and for our team to learn new technologies, right? As more and more of our vendors go API first, there's been an incredible amount of new technologies to learn. I remember when I first was a Mac admin, learning to write a bash script and being proficient in bash really covered a lot of your bases and was pretty awesome. But now more and more of the client engineering job postings and the landscape that we face as administrators, we need that familiarity with Python or different languages and being able to think about these kind of workflows at even large and small scales altogether. So I also really encourage you to check out some of the Python projects that are in the Mac admin Slack that really take a lot of the work out of writing code to handle things like this and token generation and things like that that really make it easy. So, and that'll take us over to Q&A.
Excellent. So if anybody's got any questions, please raise your hand. I will come to you, and we will go from there.
Yeah, right.
See if I look hard enough.
I'll just write out. So since y'all run everything on-prem and everything, have y'all noticed any performance impacts, either good or potentially negative from this change?
No, not with how we have it set up. And that's, what we did have to make a consideration of when we thought about turning on all policy webhooks and based on our volume. And at that point, we partnered with Jamf to say, hey, is this a good idea? Should we do this? And, they gave us some sage advice about what to do. And that's where we went to going with Smart Group. We're actually in the middle of a cloud migration right now and planning for that. And I would love to turn on all policy webhooks and ingest all of that information and visualize it. But that is definitely part of our consideration to kind of balance our core provisioning and keeping the service online against setting up all this workflow.
I really like how y'all put together the infrastructure here. I'm curious, once the webhook listener, if you will, that was taking in the commands, what type of server was it? Was it a Linux box, and maybe what language did you use to translate that in so that you could go back to Jamf with API calls?
Yeah. So none of it established on any server, like it's serverless architecture, whatever you are seeing here. So we don't patch, maintain any server. It's on the fly. It's serverless architecture what AWS provides. So if you need it, if you like, for example, if you have 5 Lambda functions need to run, AWS will maintain that required infrastructure in the backend automatically. So you don't need to maintain any Linux or any Dockers, nothing.
Yeah, so to kind of give you a little more clarity, so at that point, I think with the API, Amazon API gateway, right? So in Jamf, we went into the webhook section, and when you set up like a webhook listener in AWS with like the API gateway, you get a URL that you point Jamf at to send those webhooks. So it comes right into that, and we've got some, is that an EventBridge match? Yep. Or, yeah. So then there's that EventBridge that sits there and does a pattern match on what's coming in on that webhook so that we can identify what smart group is it coming from, and it kind of breaks it all down by there. And so and I think the back end of that is that API gateway and that URL is always listening, and then when something hits it, Amazon and Lambda spins up the rest of that on the fly on that serverless architecture. So it was nice to not have another piece of infrastructure to think about or worry about patching, or have someone in security be like, hey, you've got to update this. And it's pretty nice.
So this is really cool, and I appreciate that. But for some of us that may not be able to implement this right away, are you on MacAdmin Slack where maybe we could reach out for follow-up questions?
Absolutely, yeah. So we're both on the MacAdmin Slack, also LinkedIn. I would love to get a message on LinkedIn that was not spam from a recruiter, so feel free to find us there as well. But we'd be happy to talk about this more. There's other organizations doing this as well, and it's something we can absolutely collaborate on and give helpful advice and see what we can cook up together.
And we do have a team channel in Mac admins called Mac at Salesforce. So you can, you can ask there, like not only me, my whole team can support in case we are not available. And this solution is not only limited to AWS. You can like implement in any cloud platform if you want, Azure, Google, Heroku, MuleSoft. So it's kind of a template you can refer and you can implement in any platform, whatever your organization supports.
Thank you for the presentation. I think that using this way, we can move away many of that use cases having to running on the computers locally. But I think that there should be some kind of use case that still needs to run on the computer locally. So I'm curious to know if there is any recommendation you can think of. You gave us like two simple use cases, like using that plain text or that encrypted text. But other than those, is there any recommendations you can use?
Yeah, there's a couple different ways you can slice it, right? And I've heard you could look at it a few different ways. A broker app is a common thing we've seen where you take a programming language like Swift or Go that you can compile all the way down to a binary, and you roll a secret into there that you've either encrypted or obfuscated to then go get a token or make a more specific secure call. That's absolutely something you can do. For the purpose of this session, we wanted to kind of stick to technologies and languages that are like Python that are a little more common and script-based and make that jump from Bash and what we're familiar with. But absolutely, I think one thing that comes to mind is like PAM modules. That's a common thing that we have to deal with. And there can be a secret that you can build in Swift or Go. You can pile it down to binary. And we have found that a lot of security orgs are more okay with that than other options. And it comes back to like what kind of risk you're willing to take, how often you need to rotate those kind of secrets, and how you want to go about that. But then you kind of get to a place of what you're talking about of more granular actions that you can take at the time.
So I'm guessing that if you set different things into the asset tag, then that would, you like set static group add and it'll do that API. So I'm curious, in your environment, how many different types of commands can you put into the asset tag, and do you use the asset tag for all of them? So we do. We also, as part of the workflow, we clear the asset tag field when the function is done firing. One thing that to mitigate, someone kind of updating any extension attribute in your environment, we leverage AWS Secrets Manager with like an allow list. So the asset tag kind of follows the format of the EAID, and then whatever data you want to put in there, right? So it can be a string, it could be some numbers, whatever you want. And so when the webhook fires and it hits Lambda and the EventBridge and everything, it looks against what we have in AWS Secrets Manager of what EAs it's allowed to update, right? Because there are some things you may not want it to update. There might be a critical provisioning extension attribute that you're like, hey, like this needs to go through a different process. But you've got the flexibility with Lambda that we do 10, 12, 20, and just concatenate all of them together. You do have to be a little mindful about not getting yourself in a situation where you're having multiple policies at the same time fire.
Another challenge we ran into is that Lambda is really, really fast. So these API calls and everything would fire within milliseconds of each other, and Jamf wasn't, depending on how your clustering is in your environment and your load balancers, it was firing too fast for Jamf at times, and we'd get different nodes or things like that, and things would get a little out of sync, which is great when things are fast, but it was something that we had to learn to mitigate and kind of pace it a little bit as well.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. It's actually really good idea to go around the API secret. One question I want to ask about because you, I believe that you manipulate, example, one single asset task on multiple policy or something like that. So in the case that Lambda or Jamf API gets stuck and get in queue, so eventually it will be, that asset tag will be replaced by another, because you have multiple policy manipulate in single asset tag. So how you deal with that situation?
Yeah, you want to cover that?
So Jamf takes more time to set an asset tag than the AWS updates it. So by the time it sets, you need to run a policy like a recon to set something into the asset tag, for example. So there is a gap between two recons, right? It takes a second or 2 seconds to do that recon fast. If you think it's faster, it won't be less than 2 to 3 seconds. Within that time, this solution will complete its existing job for the asset tag.
Awesome.
So I believe there is multiple play to set up the webhook listeners. Why do you consider using the AWS instead of something like Power Automate or Okta workflow, something like that?
I mean, you sure could do that. In our use case and our organizational infrastructure, we wanted a way that, from a network layer perspective, that we could guarantee the communication in our VPC where we had some existing Jamf infrastructure. So having this set up in AWS, it allowed us to do that quickly, and that was a key thing for us at the time. You absolutely could do this in Power Automate. You could do this in MuleSoft. You could do it with a number of different solutions. And so I think that's what's kind of great about this solution, is that you can apply it to kind of, if you have existing infrastructure or organizational preferences about where you deploy those sorts of things, you can make that work. And yeah, but yeah, to answer your question, that's what worked for us, but you can absolutely be very flexible with this.
Well, I do not want to be that person that cuts the party short, but we are at time. I'd like to thank both of you for presenting this to us. It was very helpful and informational.
Thank you.